Hello and welcome to Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. I'm Becky Parker Geist and I'm your host. Audiobook Connection is your place to learn about the audiobook creative process and for authors to learn valuable tips on producing and marketing your audiobooks. This podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Thanks for being with me today. We're going to talk about the value of audiobook pre-production. And there are many values that are available to you when you do a full and robust pre-production process. Now, to just provide initially an overarching benefit of doing pre-production, and there are a couple things that I'm going to focus on more in this particular episode. And the first is organization. When you enter the project, as with, so many things in life, right? When you enter the project organized, where you know exactly what you're going to be doing and how you're going to be doing it, you have less confusion and you have more efficiency. Now, there are other benefits, and I've actually covered those benefits in many other episodes, but some of the bigger benefits that are not related just to the work process itself have to do with the benefits that you can gain from a marketing perspective. When you want to have the success, and that success is defined in your own, for yourself, so I'll come back to that, but when you want to have success with your audiobook, it is wise to plan for it, to actually take advantage of and leverage the fact that you're doing an audiobook so that you can gain the benefits that it will potentially provide. I mentioned success. Well, success is a very personal definition, right? You define success for yourself. Each person does. What does success mean to you? Well, that's where we look at, what are our goals for our audiobook? When you have determined what it is that you would like to achieve, what you would like your listeners to do or have or gain as a result of listening to and buying your audiobook, then you can be much clearer as you head into pre-production what your intended outcome is, and that in turn can affect some of the choices that you make. As I said, in this episode, I'm going to focus just a little bit more on the production process and the benefits that you'll be gaining as a result of effective and robust pre-production and the thinking that goes into that for your audiobook. And part of why I wanted to cover these today is these are many times things that as an author, you probably wouldn't even think about. Well, some of them are going to be things that you wouldn't even think about because unless you're immersed in the audiobook world and have experience with how some of these things can go terribly awry, then you just wouldn't know. You wouldn't know to ask. You wouldn't know to think about it. So that's why I wanted to bring it to your attention so that as you head into your audiobook pre-production process, you'll have a better understanding, first of all, of what to do if you're doing your own pre-production, or some of the things that you should expect if you're working with a company that is doing pre-production, such as Pro Audio Voices. It can also help you understand that if you're working with a company or an individual who is planning to produce your audiobook for you and there is no attention to the pre-production, some of the things that could potentially go wrong. So I mentioned a couple things, less confusion and more efficiency. And this first item is definitely in this realm. And this, again, is something that you might not even think about, but it's important. And that is file naming. How are your files, your audio files, going to be named? Here's why it's important. if you, for example, just have no numbers on them, you don't know track numbers, but you just maybe call the file the title of the chapter, and maybe you don't have chapter numbers, you just have names of chapters, that's totally fine to do. But if you name your files that way, then when you go to organize them, you may find that, especially if you have somebody helping you, that they may not readily know the names of the files, and the files are not going to organize themselves in terms of, like, typically we have like an alphabetical automatic sorting, a default sorting method. The most common are either by the file name or by the date created. Well, if you're not using an appropriate file naming structure, you're just going to end up with a list of files, and you may easily get the chapters of your audiobook out of order. This is the moment when you would discover this would be between the time that you upload your files, potentially in the wrong order because it's not obvious what the order is, and then having it be live, and suddenly you realize then if you go to listen to it, or you have a customer who comes back to you and says, this doesn't really make sense, it's like somehow in the wrong order, or somebody who is familiar with your book in another format, but then they discover, let's say if you have an ebook and an audiobook and someone is using one of those features where it goes back and forth between the two, you could have a real disaster on your hands. If you're working with an audio engineer and a narrator, and your files are not named consistently with an appropriate naming structure, you're going to have a mess between the team members, whoever you have helping you out. And so it's important to really think through what is an appropriate naming structure, making sure that typically at the front end, you use consecutive numbers that are going to make it clear what the order of the files should be. So when I talk about pre-production and you're planning out that naming structure, you're also, as a part of your process, going to figure out exactly where each new track begins. You might think, well, wouldn't that be obvious? Well, not necessarily. Let's say, for example, it might be obvious. Maybe you have a very simple, straightforward fiction book, and it is perfectly obvious, but not necessarily. Let's take an example. Let's say we have a book that is a nonfiction book, and there is in the content, let's just say it's a meditation. You have a meditation is one of your tracks. Well, you may want to make it possible for your listeners who perhaps might be driving at the time that they're listening to your audiobook. You might want to make it easy for them to skip ahead after the meditation so that they're not getting lulled by the meditation while they're driving, which would obviously not be ideal. Even if they recognize that they should be paying attention to their driving, the sounds from the meditation could be challenging for them. So you really want to have that meditation be its own track so that if they do jump a track, that it lands right after the meditation. Well, if your meditation is, as would be typical, in the middle of a chapter rather than at the beginning and end of a chapter, in other words, it's not a chapter unto itself most often, right? Well, you need to plan that out. Again, because you need to know what the track order is going to be and where you want those new tracks to begin. Now, let's say, for example, you have even, let's say, a fiction book where you have really, really long chapters. But maybe you have your chapters broken down. Maybe there are segments that maybe they're just separated, by a gap or something, but they are segmented in some way. You might decide that you'd like to have, especially if the chapters are like over an hour long, you might find that you need to split up those chapters into smaller tracks. And using your breaks that you have written into the story, those would be good places. But you'll want to decide that in advance, or you could end up with a narrator who splits it in a different place, and then you have confusion between narrator, audio engineer, yourself, or it may be a point in the story where they realize, the track, there's a limit to how long an audio track can be in an audiobook. So if the narrator decides where to split it, and then you go back and you say, well, no, that's a terrible point to split it in terms of the actual story. I would rather have this cliffhanger moment and then, split it there. Even though the experience from the listener, they're going to have a continuous play, but there will be a longer gap because at the head and tail of each file, there needs to be space. And so you're going to get a gap of, let's say, at least, about 3 to 5 seconds that is going to happen at whatever that split place is. So anyway, these are some reasons why you'll want to make sure that your pre-production includes your file naming and where those tracks are going to begin. All right. The next item we want to focus on is the front matter. All of those parts in the front, whether it's dedication, prologue, maybe you have disclaimers. There are many times, advance praise. There are a lot of things in the front of the book. And you're going to want to determine which things are going to be included. In other words, which will be read, which things will be omitted, and which things will be included but moved to the end. For example, if you have put your acknowledgments at the beginning of your book, but you really want them to be read, move them to the end, because you don't want to delay your listeners' enjoyment of the body of the book. It's totally fine for them to be in there, but move them to the end. So you want to make those decisions. You may also, just as an example, if you have a lot of advance praise at the beginning of your book, or you could use your book description as well. If you have a plan for social media and you know that recording those testimonials could be valuable as content for your social media, then in particular, if you are paying somebody to narrate your book, then you'll want those pieces to be done as part of the overall process. And you'll want the files properly named for those segments that are not going to be in your audiobook, but they are still going to be recorded. Okay, so I'm pulling those two things together. Now, if you're not marketing or you're not doing any kind of marketing where you think that those advanced praise or reviews, testimonials will be helpful to you, then you can just omit those. But I just wanted to bring that up as often it's front matter that you will want to make a decision about. You also don't want your narrator reading those advanced praise segments, testimonials, if you're not planning to use them. And so you don't want to waste their time and then be adding files that don't belong, right? So you could end up with additional confusion there. So now there are also books. What if your book, you're planning to use more than one narrator? Pre-production is the time when you're going to want to clarify for your readers who is reading which parts. So you want to make that very clear and make sure that the track numbers or the file names and tracks are all going to line up with who's reading what. Now, if you have, let's say, like an interview where you're going to have two different voices going back and forth between the two, you're not going to want to label each separate line as a separate track. No, it's depending on the length of the question and answer, it's possible you might want to have a separate track for each question and answer set, but more typically you would want to include have each narrator naming their file appropriately with the same track number, but indicating their name, so that when your audio engineer puts it together, they will be really clear that this is the same track, and each voice for that track is what they would then be assembling. And just to come back again to that point about if you wanted to have each set of question and answer as its own track, let's say if they're longer, or if you think that your listeners might benefit from being able to jump perhaps to either bookmark or to find again a question-answer set that you have in your book, those would be potentially good reasons to set each of those apart as on its own track. Let's just take a short pause, and then when we come back, we'll talk more about some of the things that you'll want to prepare in advance as a part of your pre-production for your audiobook. Here at Pro Audio Voices, we love working with authors who have a big goal in mind. They really want to reach out to their audience around the world. We're here to help make that happen. It starts with our pre-production process, where we're evaluating and determining what elements of the audiobook we can leverage to both create an excellent listener experience for your listeners, as well as drawing them to your website to engage with you further. It continues on through the production process, making decisions that will enhance and support your big goals, as well as creating a great listener experience. But we don't stop there. Once the audiobook is live, we move on to helping you market your audiobook with the Audiobook Marketing Program. Come check us out at proaudiovoices.com. To schedule a call to talk about your audiobook project, click on Get Started. Okay, and we're back. So one of the next things that you'll want to prepare, think about, figure out is whether you're planning to use any sound effects or music, and this can be applicable to fiction or nonfiction. Some examples of how you might use either or both in nonfiction would be, for example, like the meditation that I mentioned as a possibility. In the meditation, you'll want to include some sort of music that is appropriate to your meditation. And then there might be other things. For example, maybe you want to just give people time to do some exercises. And when I say exercises, I'm most often, in a book, most often we're referring to exercises that are like answering questions, thinking about something in particular. But they could be physical as well. Could be a breathing exercise or some kind of other thing. But these are moments where we want our listeners to take action of some kind. We want them to stay with us while they do it. So it's really helpful to give them some music so that they know the audio is still running. This is what we expect of them. And then they can go ahead and be doing that thing that we have asked them to do. With fiction, it may be easier to imagine in that there might be moments, could be just opening and closing credits, could be beginning of parts if your book has, larger parts sections. It could be music that supports the action of the story. There are lots and lots of ways to use music and sound effects. In poetry, using some kind of chime or sound or phrase of music can be helpful either as undercurrent for the poem or as a separation between poems so that we give the listener a chance to absorb and think about and, process the poem that they have just heard. Mapping out in advance what you're going to need is really helpful because, in part, it can impact how your narrator is going to read it. Now, most often, narrators don't hear what music is going to be playing. But if you've selected music for a passage, let's say, and you provide that to your narrator, it's going to really help them get a feel for the vibe that you're after, right? So, and I know as a narrator myself, I love having music in advance if I know what it's going to be, because you can actually have that music playing like I can have it playing in my headphones so that I can narrate to that music, and that can make a really awesome result. Next up is instructions. This is for nonfiction, if you are asking your listeners to do a thing, any kind of immediate call to action in the moment, right? And that might be answering questions, for example. Anything that you're asking them to do that will potentially be a problem in one context or another. Let's say, for example, you're asking them to do something that requires them to close their eyes. Obviously, we don't want to invite them to do that while they're driving or any other things where they really need to have their eyes open. Or you might be asking them to do something that requires paper and pen. They may not always have that available. So we want to think about what we're asking our listeners to do and then provide some instruction for the audio listener that's going to be different for the print text, right? People who are working with and are reading a print text are going to have a different experience. So we want to consider what their experience is in that moment and write instructions that are appropriate so that we don't lose them. And when I say don't lose them, I'm talking about that little distracting moment that can happen when asked to do something that we can't actually do in the moment because of our own situation. Then there's the moment where we have to oh, wait, I can't do that now. What do I do instead? Am I going to skip ahead? Am I going to just listen to it? Am I going to try to think about it, but not try to do the thing because I have to have my eyes up? What are those things I need to do? Well, now your mind is racing through trying to figure out the moment. And what I'm suggesting is that you provide the instructions in a general enough but clear enough way, an alternative way to handle the upcoming moment so that your listeners, no matter what their situation is, they will know exactly what you're recommending they do. Next item, and I mentioned this a little bit in the front matter, which is where it frequently appears, most often appears, and that is disclaimers. Many times, now depends on your content. Is the disclaimer one that you feel really important to include from a legal perspective? Let's say, for example, it's a book that includes medical information, and you want a disclaimer about you are not attempting to diagnose and, all of that. That's an important disclaimer that you probably will want your listeners to have at the front of that book, and which is probably where you would have placed it. If it is a disclaimer about this fiction story is not based on any real people and that kind of disclaimer, you might choose to omit it if you don't feel it's important to include, or you might choose to just tack it on at the back just so your bases are covered and you can point to it if somebody has an issue with it. Obviously, there would be some reason why you put it in the print text, so you'll want to think about, does that matter here as well? I mean, they're still customers. They're still consuming your content, so you may want to include it. But the placement of it does not have to be at the beginning. It's fine and a good idea to remove anything between the opening credits and getting into your story or content that's going to hold up the process for your listener. So if you can move your disclaimer safely to the end, I would recommend that. Now, you also want to think about bonus materials. Do you want to include any bonus materials? Things like a segment from an interview, or perhaps a sample or sneak peek or something like that from one of your other books. If you're doing an audiobook that's part of a series, then it becomes pretty obvious that it would be really great to have a sneak preview of the next book in the series. even if it's not in audio yet, even if you haven't finished writing it yet. The idea is to whet their appetite, right? So these are the kinds of things that you could include as bonus material. When you're doing your pre-production, this is the time to be thinking about, do I want to include some, and what would I like it to be? Because you'll need to prepare that information or that content. If it's a sneak peek at some other of your books, then you'll need to provide that text for your narrator. If it's an interview that hasn't been recorded yet, then you're going to want to make sure that gets recorded or scheduled and recorded, and that audio is of the high quality that you're going to want for your audiobook. And if you're only going to include part of interview, then you'll also want to, once it is recorded, determine what that cutoff point is going to be, and make sure that if you're going to invite them to your website to hear the whole thing, or to your YouTube channel, that you actually get that video posted in those places. As you can see, there are lots of things to be thinking about during pre-production. It still blows my mind that so many production companies don't really even do anything much in pre-production, that they just kind of jump straight into the production process of, hey, let's record this audiobook. We've got your text, let's go. There are so many things that can be overlooked and opportunities that can be missed if you skip a full, robust pre-production. Remember that when you do pre-production for your audiobook, you are better organizing, which means when you're better organized, that means you're going to be more efficient. You're going to have better relationships with your team members, like your narrator, your audio engineer, your production company, and that's going to lead to a better overall experience. And you will also, most likely, because you've set yourself up for it, achieve better leveraged success, according to your own definition of success, for your audiobook. Thank you so much for being with me today. If this content is something that you think would be useful to somebody that you know, I hope that you'll share this episode with them. And I would also greatly appreciate it if you've received value from it, if you would let others know, even if it's just a general post on your social media. If you'd like to support the podcast, we do have a Patreon account at patreon.com/audiobookconnectionpodcast. Thank you again for being with me. If you are ready to explore pre-production for your own audiobook, come to proaudiovoices.com and let's schedule a call so we can talk about it. Have an awesome day. Thanks for joining us for Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. Please take a moment to subscribe at audiobookconnection.com. The podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Learn more at proaudiovoices.com. Again, thanks for being with us, and please join us next week.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.